Thank you for joining me here on this video. This is Tyrese Lawson, and I'm coming to you today to give you a look at some topics that we discussed throughout the African American Studies class this semester. But most importantly, something that I found very interesting was the Civil Rights Movement, which occurred from 1955 to 1965, where racial tensions were at its high throughout those 10 years in the United States. And today we're going to be talking to you about the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which Rosa Parks played a major role in, and also the sittings and the 1963 March on Washington that Martin Luther King delivered his speech in Washington, D.C. And we also have one of my very own friends, Daniel Rogers. He's going to be asking some questions that he have and misconceptions that he heard about throughout the civil rights movement, but I'm going to also be asking him some questions. But right now, this picture that you see on your screen, this is a picture that I got off of Google. You can see it's Rosa Parks and the guy that's sitting behind her, which is a white guy, and she's actually sitting in front of him. And this was a time where she was asked to get up and move back, and she refused to. And a misconception about this was that Rosa Parks did this all because she was tired. She didn't feel like getting up, but this was actually part of a plan that she took out from an organization that she was part of. And this was the beginning of what was to come. The Montgomery Bus Boycott was a major time here across the South where a lot of people, especially African Americans, boycotted the bus, and the revenue for buses went down because if you don't have any blacks, you didn't have a lot of money coming to the transportation system for the buses. And that was because most blacks used the buses during that time. That was a very important key feature for us here across the United States. And after the Montgomery Boycott, that's when SCLC was organized, and that was a Southern Christian Leadership Conference, where the first president of that conference was Martin Luther King Jr. And on the side, you can see it says Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and in the middle it says We Shall Overcome. That organization was not organized by Martin Luther King, but it was also used as a very key point, and it was an organization also that created a lot of tension in the United States. But right now I'm going to kind of move the camera over, and we're going to talk and discuss a little bit about some questions that I wanted to ask my friend Daniel Rogers again. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us. And just to give people a little bit of background on yourself and where you're from so they can kind of know these questions I'm going to ask you about, just like that. So explain to the people where you're from.
Okay, my name is Daniel Rogers. I'm from Seneca, South Carolina, conservative upstate South Carolina.
Yes, and the first question I have to ask you, when you hear the word race, what do you feel like? What is race to you?
I feel like race is not only defining a type of skin color that you may have, but is also defining the cultural impacts that your skin color may have had throughout the history.
And that's almost actually correct, because race is defined as a social construct, which means depending on where you go at in the world, your race will be judged differently based on how that place that you go in the world view that race. Exactly. So that's also very accurate. And when you hear racism, what's the first word that come to your mind?
Frustration.
Yes, and that's
I take that back. Ignorance, actually. I find that racism is not a choice. It is not something that people necessarily are made to know and live their life by. It is something that is taught from outside points of views, and throughout time and growing up throughout your life into certain values that you may start to believe, But no, I don't believe racism is necessarily I'm at a loss for words.
Yeah, racism was, I understand that, because when you hear and just to hear that it's starting back again, but before we get to how currently it is now and how prevalent it is, we can talk about something that was very weird, was the 15th Amendment, which was in 1870, where African Americans were supposed to be allowed to vote, but that's when that's when slavery was abolished with the 15th Amendment. But slavery was abolished with the 15th Amendment, but it did not, it abolished slavery, but it did not abolish discrimination against blacks. So blacks endured racism for many years, but let's just say from 1870 to the Voting Rights Acts of 1965, where African Americans were allowed to vote, and that was signed in from President Lyndon Johnson. And again, that was a very most big achievement from the civil rights movement, was when Lyndon Johnson came through and he signed it, the Act, which said that all African Americans, no matter what race or anything you is, all fellow Americans should be allowed the right to vote. And again, the Civil Rights Movement and ended segregation in public places and banning employment of discriminations on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin when it was a major effect, and that was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And following that year, you had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where again President Lyndon signed that all blacks should be able to vote, no matter what color your skin is. All fellow Americans, as I should say, should be able to vote. The picture that you see here was actually a picture where you had a lot of whites that was marching and protesting, and just as we had blacks, we seen it when we had the civil rights movement, you kind of goes to Martin Luther King, but you had many whites protesting during that time. And this picture was taken, I believe, from Alabama in front of some kind of state building, and you can see some signs that say race mixing is communist and stop the race mixing. And this was how whites viewed during this time. They were felt that they were superior to blacks and that mixing was not necessary. They should be able to keep blacks to the back, and then you have whites to the front, and all this other extra stuff was not needed. And again, when the Voting Rights Act of 1965 occurred, it kind of put the end to this literacy test where blacks had to take tests in order to vote. And during that time, a literacy test means your ability to read and write. And during that time, you didn't have many African Americans who did not know how to do that. We had poll tax, we had grandfather clause, and we even had a gumball count where you had to guess the amount of gumballs in a jar, which I think is so very ridiculous and very ignorant during that time period, where it was kind of stupid to say the least. And again, that was a very key important time for our area. And something else I thought was very important, that blacks voted for Republicans. They were actually, the party that blacks were a part of was Republicans from 1870 until 1932. And that's when a lot of African Americans switched over to Democrats from 1932 to present day. And this was a very key important time for us here in the United States. And just, again, having you here to be able to explain as a white male how it was, you never really seen racism. You never seen a lot of things that, say, for instance, myself would have gone through if we were part of that time. I think it was very incredible just to see the change that we have went through since the 1960s and how we evolved so much over the last couple of years. Again, the civil rights movement, I cannot even explain to you all the stuff that occurred during that time and what we went through because the short amount of time that we have in this video. But again, one big key factor of the civil rights movement, again, I continue to emphasize the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed a lot of blacks and fellow Americans the right to vote without having literacy tests and all these other requirements that was very, as I should say, very wrong to have during that time. So President Lyndon Johnson, who was the vice president of J.F. Kennedy, who also was assassinated during the 1960s, was the person that signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And for that, we have him to thank about him for. And again, all of that other stuff. So again, we have a lot of stuff that we should have covered, but we just want to give you an idea of how key features was throughout this time, and again, how this was a very important time in American history. If you have not, you really need to think about this and learn about this, because again, this is a change during the 50s and 60s and even 70s where a lot of things changed here in the United States. And again, I want to thank my friend Daniel for joining me today and just giving you guys an update on how he felt about the situation and what he felt when he heard the word race. He thought it was a social construct based on his definition, and that's basically what it was. So thank you guys for joining me again. This is Tyrese Lawson with your video.